So, taking us from that broad conversation about how to strategically address and begin to prepare your workplace to be a more receptive and inclusive space and to actually meet the mandates of equity, diversity, and inclusion, we're gonna pivot to talk a little bit about some of the specific racial and ethnic inequalities in the return to work process that we all went through as we were, exiting out of particularly the work from home process of COVID-19. And to take us through that complex and interesting topic, we have with us Dr. Basak Yanar. Dr. Yanar is an associate scientist at the Institute for Work and Health and an assistant professor in the Division of Social and Behavioral Health Sciences in the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. She holds a PhD in organizational behavior and human resource management from the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. Yanar's research interests include understanding the working conditions and health and safety needs of populations experiencing occupational health and safety vulnerabilities, such as immigrant and refugee workers, small businesses, and workers experiencing mental health challenges, and also the workplace practices and system supports that make injury prevention and return to work more equitable and accessible for these populations. Her emerging program of research explores how employers can better respond to health and safety needs of immigrant and refugee workers and foster inclusive safety practices in workplaces that are becoming increasingly culturally and linguistically diverse. Yanar is a qualitative researcher with a keen interest in collaboration with community organizations, employers, and system partners in developing solutions to improve the health and safety of workers. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. I will be, as I have been through the day, in monitoring our chat and our Q&A, and I'll bring forward anything that needs to be addressed. Thank you so much for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle, for having me. And I'm really excited to be presenting as part of this webinar series. I think I can share my screen, right? So I will be sharing my presentation. Okay. Let me know if you can see it. Can you see my presentation?
Not just yet. We
Not
did have
yet.
we had a
Okay.
challenge with this with our last presenter. If you're having trouble
Okay.
figuring it out, you can just email it to me and I'll flip it if necessary.
Let me try again.
There we go. That's
Can you
looking
see it
promising.
now? Okay, wonderful.
Perfect.
Okay, so great. I apologize. I won't be able to see anyone as I'm presenting, but I hope you can see me. So I will be presenting to you today our research on our findings from a systematic review focusing on the role race and racism can play in the return to work of workers facing injury and illness. So I'll be presenting this research on behalf of our research team, and especially Dr. Arfjada, who is our principal investigator. So for those who may now not know who we are, just wanted to give you maybe a quick introduction to Institute for Work and Health. We are a not-for-profit research organization based in Toronto, Ontario, and we conduct and share research to protect and improve the health of working people. So we do our research in two broad domains, preventing work-related injury and illness through studies of workplace programs and practices, prevention policies, and the health of workers at a population level. Also, we conduct research on improving the health and recovery of injured workers through research on treatment, return to work, disability prevention and management, and compensation policies. I would like to briefly acknowledge the members of our research team, as well as contributors to our research. And actually, the systematic review just was recently published in the Journal of Occupational Rehabilitation's free access if anyone is interested in learning more. So why should we be studying race? And I would like to bring more of a public health context. I know that today there has been very important conversation happened in this webinar series about race and racism in the workplace. But I would like to start with to give you an idea about how we approached some of these terminologies in our research. So before, again, diving into the context of our study, so I want to provide some of these terms with you. So when we refer to race and ethnicity, we're referring to the broad categories describing groups of people who share or perceive to share similar physical or cultural attributes, such as broad categories like white, black, South Asian, Eastern European, and so on. And in this presentation, I'll sometimes use the term race and when referring to both race and ethnicity. And when we refer to racism, we're describing a system of oppression and status, resources, and opportunities that are inequitably distributed based on race or ethnicity, giving rise to racial and ethnic inequities. So what do we know about racial and ethnic inequities? So one thing that we know for certain is that they have no basis in biology. And the reason we know that is due to vast body of science telling us that racial and ethnic categories simply do not map on to genetic diversity in any meaningful way. And the scientific consensus about race and ethnicity today is that they are fundamentally social rather than biological constructs. So what does that mean? So it means that race and ethnicity provide us with no meaningful information about biological information, but what it provides us with is a wealth of information about how people are perceived and treated in the world. They tell us about a person's relative social position in society, and that's why we call them social constructs. While they lack a biological basis, because race and ethnicity affects the way that we are perceived in the world, and treated in the world, they have very real consequences for our lives. And one area of where these consequences have been very well documented is the field of public health. So racial inequities have been observed for nearly every known health outcome. Diabetes, hypertension, cancer, asthma, infant mortality, you name it. So all of these health outcomes have been shown to be socially patterned according to race and ethnicity. Wanted to bring you an example. On this slide, we present data from Statistics Canada describing mortality rates from COVID-19 across different racial and ethnic groups. And in a nutshell, the distribution of deaths from COVID-19 has followed roughly the same distribution of other health outcomes, with higher rates among non-white groups in general, and the highest rates among most marginalized racial and ethnic groups, including Black Canadians. And data such as this not only alerts us to the presence of overall racial and ethnic inequities in health, but also to important variation within broad category of people of color, such that racial and ethnic inequities are larger for some groups and smaller or sometimes even non-existent for other groups. And we'll be returning to this question of heterogeneity among people of color later in the presentation. But I just want to give a little sidebar about the terminology here. You'll notice that Statistics Canada uses the term non-racialized population to refer to white people, and the term racialized population to refer to people of color. So we prefer to use the terms white and non-white, and we did so in our research. And we use these terms with the full appreciation that language is constantly evolving and that no single set of terms, including the ones that we prefer to use, will resonate with every single person. And if there are any questions about the choice of terms, happy to discuss that. So because race and ethnicity, again, lack a biological basis, and racial and ethnic inequities in health cannot be attributed to these. Instead, what we learned is that these health inequities are rooted in underlying social and economic inequities. And those social and economic inequities are themselves due to racism. In other words, racial and ethnic groups experience different levels of health because they experience different levels of resources that matter for health. And those differences in resources are a function of widespread discrimination in our society, including discrimination at the structural level, like in our social policies, and at an interpersonal level, like in our everyday interactions at work. And this is the big idea that we borrowed from the neighboring fields like public health to provide a context to our study. The idea that when we measure race, we are in fact measuring effects of racism. So the insights I provided are complemented by a broad body of research highlighting the racial inequities in occupational health and safety, which has provided foundation for our research in return to work. And I would like to give you one of the earliest examples. One of the first widely documented cases of racial inequity in the field of occupational health and safety occurred in 1930s in West Virginia, USA, during the Great Depression. Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation began constructing a 3-mile tunnel through Gauley Mountain to divert water to a plant downstream to generate power for iron smelting. And nearly 3,000 workers were employed over the course of the project. 80% of those workers were Black, and this is despite the fact that neighboring communities around Gauley Mountain were primarily white. And according to historical documentation, Black workers were disproportionately placed in the most hazardous jobs in the tunnel when compared to white workers. To note, Gauley Mountain was 99% pure sandstone, and drilling through the sandstone basically kicks up the silica dust, a known carcinogen. And Union Carbide was aware of the possible health consequences, but they failed to take safety precautions to minimize the dust. And given the poor conditions, workers experienced negative health effects soon after the construction began. And it is estimated that 80% of workers became ill, died, or walk off the job after 6 months. And when all said and done, at least 764 workers died from silicosis. And most of those adversely affected were Black workers. So disadvantage faced by Black workers and workers of color persists to this day. And studies from industrialized countries consistently find, when compared to white workers, non-white workers are more likely to work in occupations with the highest injury risk, more likely to be exposed to hazardous working conditions, more likely to experience fatal occupational injuries, less likely to be diagnosed with an occupational injury and receive treatment, and more likely to underreport a workplace injury. So, given the research in the field of occupational health and safety, we can ask ourselves, how do race and ethnicity shape return to work experiences? So many people today may or may not be aware of the return to work process, but I wanted to give you a brief overview. Return to work design is defined by a set of steps initiated following an injury or illness. So for those injured at work, this can include reporting of the injuries, seeking medical care, obtaining workers' compensation benefits, accessing rehabilitation services, accommodation planning, and work integration and stay at work. And return to work process occurs within a complex system, including many multiple actors such as the workplace, clinicians, clinical and sometimes in legal settings. It includes workers themselves as their employers, healthcare providers, workers' compensation representatives, and legislators. And the return to work can be relatively straightforward. However, sometimes injured workers can face extended or intermittent work disability that results in significant personal, employer, and social costs. And structural and interpersonal racism may exist at all different phases of this return to work process, and it can contribute to disparate return to work outcomes between workers of color and their white counterparts. So our overarching research objective was to examine whether there are racial and ethnic inequities in return to work outcomes among workers who experience an occupational or non-occupational injury or illness. To address our research objective, we conducted a systematic review of the literature, and I'll tell you a little bit about this process. So systematic reviews aim to identify primary research and appraise their methodological quality and synthesize research findings. So our process aligned with the previous systematic reviews that we conducted at the Institute for Work and Health, which included developing a search strategy, conducting a rigorous review of a peer-reviewed literature, identifying relevant articles, appraising the methodological quality of eligible studies and extracting and synthesizing data from these studies. And our approach was replicable, transparent, and scientific, which provided confidence in the key messages that we produced to inform decision making. And in the following slides, I will highlight some of the aspects of the systematic review more in depth. So how did we conduct our literature search? So first we wanted to retrieve studies using academic search portals. And we combined search terms, we call them PECO, PECO, as you can see, parameters to retrieve articles that focused on workers with a work interruption due to an injury or illness. We retrieved studies examining experiences of workers with either an occupational or a non-occupational injury or illness. And we acknowledge that return to work policies and procedures tend to differ according to whether a person is injured at work or outside of work. And to account for this difference, the results from both groups, we ultimately considered them as distinct in our evidence synthesis. We also retrieved studies which compared non-white workers to white workers, as well as there were studies which compared racial and ethnic minority workers to racial and ethnic majority workers. I'll give you an example soon. And we made the decision to examine ethnicity, since in some industrialized labor markets, white workers aren't the racial majority, and studies within these contexts use the terms race and ethnicity interchangeably. In studies focusing on ethnicity, we examined the published description of the study samples to ensure that there was some mention of racial differences. So how did we identify relevant studies? So what we did is we went first through the title and abstract and then the full text reviews. So among the research, we found two reviewers, so from our research team, independently evaluated the title and abstract of each article, as well as the full text of each article to determine their relevancy. So in addition to some of the criteria that informed our search strategy, studies that we carried forward for full synthesis included those based in OECD labor market contexts and were quantitative studies where statistical effects were reported. And in addition to including studies comparing workers according to race and ethnicity, articles also could be included if they measured the concept of racism and examined how racism was related to return to work. So we included those studies as well. However, no studies we identified fit the criteria for a full text review. And to ensure we maintain focus on our exposure of interest, which we did not include studies focusing on immigrant or linguistic minority workers where the race of the worker was not specified. So finally, after our reviews, next step is about the quality assessment. So we appraised the methodological qualitative of each study using a tool designed at the Institute for Work and Health. We created these tools to evaluate the methodological quality and risk of bias of each relevant article we identified. So there are certain criteria that the studies had to kind of check. So the assessment of the quality allowed us to determine high, medium, or low quality studies. I know it looks a little bit, there's a lot of details here, but I'm hoping that I can explain better. So based on findings with comparable outcome measures, we synthesize findings to generate key messages. And how it works is we use an evidence synthesis algorithm, which considered the quantity and the quality of the evidence pointing to a specific finding. So what happens is key messages with a strong level of evidence were those that had a minimum of 3 high quality studies, which showed agreement in findings across a specific outcome. So those are, and with a strong level of evidence, we can actually make specific recommendations. And messages with moderate level of evidence had a minimum of 2 high quality studies, which agree, or 2 moderate and at least 1 high-quality studies which show agreement in findings across specific outcomes. And with that kind of moderate level of evidence, we can make some practice recommendations. And finally, with limited or mixed levels of evidence to an outcome, we cannot make any specific recommendations as there is insufficient amounts of evidence. So in terms of thinking about our results, so I want to show you our kind of flow chart of our review. So through our literature review, we identified over 15,000 articles that fit our, as I showed you, PICO, so population, outcome, and our interest. And of those, 446 articles had titles and abstracts which suggested relevancy. And 2 independent reviewers did a deep dive into these full texts. And of those 446 articles, ultimately, 19 relevant studies were identified, and 10 appraised a high quality, 9 studies were appraised as medium quality, and no studies were appraised as low quality. So that was the technical part of our systematic review. And I can share with you some of the findings and what we have found. So of those 19 studies, 16 of them were conducted in the United States, 2 studies were conducted in Israel, and 1 was conducted in United Kingdom. And when we look at the injury or illness type, 15 of the 19 studies focused on workers with a non-occupational injury or illness. These included spine injuries, cancer, limb trauma, burn injury, and a stroke. And only 4 studies actually included participants with occupational injuries or illness. And of those, 3 focused on workers who had experiences of low back pain, and 1 study broadly focused on workers' compensation claimants. And when we look at the racial and ethnic breakdown in the studies, we examined the breakdown of participants according to race or ethnicity and the reference group to which they were compared. So there was a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the terminology used in these studies. Most studies included samples of with Black participants, sometimes labeled as African American, and several studies included samples with Hispanic, Latinx, and or Mexican American participants. And a subset of studies included samples that grouped participants across multiple racial groups who were characterized as non-white or other race. And 17 of these 19 studies compared findings to white workers who were the most common reference group, also labeled as Caucasian or non-Hispanic white in some studies. And 2 studies actually were from Israel, and they compared the ethnic majority Jewish Israeli workers to racial and ethnic majority minority workers, including the Arab Israeli workers or immigrant workers from Ethiopia and Soviet Union. And most studies collected the information on return to work dichotomously, which basically they looked at whether or not a person returned to work after injury. And several studies examined the duration of the work disability episode. And a handful of studies collected information on whether a worker received income support during a work absence or the total cost and length of a workers' compensation claim. So in looking at the findings of the studies identified in our review as a whole, it is clear that across the different return to work outcomes and in different labor market setting contexts, non-white and racial and ethnic minority workers experienced adverse return to work outcomes when compared to white workers or ethnic majority workers. So this core finding was consistent across the studies uncovered in our review, with the exception of 2 studies which identified mixed or inconclusive results. I want to give you some findings from some of the selective studies to give you a flavor of some of these studies and what they looked at. So in a study of 548 employed women diagnosed with breast cancer, findings indicated that Black women were less likely to return to work when compared to their white counterparts 2 months following a diagnosis. In another study of 374 workers' compensation claims with low back pain, white participants were more likely to report being employed 6 months after their workers' compensation claim when compared to Black participants. And a study of 125 stroke survivors found that Latinx participants were less likely to return to work 90 days following a stroke when compared to white participants. And other studies indicated that non-white workers received less total workers' compensation or disability income support and were more likely to report post-injury financial stress and struggle when compared to white workers. So among the studies identified in our review, there was inconsistency in terms of the return to work outcomes collected and study population characteristics. This made the synthesis of our evidence and development of our key messages challenging. However, we did have a sufficient amount of evidence to synthesize findings across studies examining return to work following non-occupational injury or illness to create some corresponding practice-based messages. So we started our synthesis by pooling findings across non-white workers. And based on a strong level of evidence, our systematic review found that non-white workers are less likely to report returning to work following a non-occupational injury or illness compared to white workers. And based on the strong level of evidence, we suggest that non-white workers will benefit from specific policy and program attention to support return to work. And we were able to drill down further from this overall finding and focus specifically on Black workers who were the focus of a sufficient quantity of high and medium quality studies. So based on a moderate level of evidence in studies of workers with a non-occupational injury or illness, our synthesis of evidence indicated that Black workers may face specific obstacles to returning to work when compared to white workers. And based on this moderate level of evidence, our review suggests that Black workers could benefit from tailored policy and program attention to address unique experiences return to work. There was limited, mixed, or insufficient evidence that existed across the other return to work outcomes identified in our review. As a result, corresponding practice messages could not be developed. So it is important that absence of evidence, though, does not mean that race or ethnic inequities don't exist. They may simply point to the absence of research in this area. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the discussion. So how do we interpret our findings from our systematic review of the literature? Well, an interesting observation about the studies included in our review is that they have surprisingly little to say about the mechanisms underlying racial and ethnic inequities in return to work. While they do a good job of telling us that these inequities exist, the studies we reviewed offered little insight on why they exist. And I will return to this point about the literature in a few moments, but for now, I want to suggest that one way that we can get around this problem is by piecing together the evidence from neighboring fields like public health and sociology to help better sense of our findings. And the key idea that we want to borrow from these neighboring fields is the one I presented earlier in the presentation, that the idea that when we measure race, we are in fact measuring the effects of racism. So that's the conceptual angle that we take to understand the inequities in health. And it's a conceptual angle that we think should be applied to understand racial and ethnic inequities in return to work. So the argument that we're trying to develop here is that we need to start paying greater attention to racism as a barrier to return to work. We have extensive background evidence implicating racism as a fundamental cause of racial and ethnic inequities in return to work. And the notion here is that workers of color experience systemic barriers across various phases and components of return to work process. And these compounding barriers add up essentially to diminish opportunities for people of color to return to work following an injury or illness. So this could be experiencing discrimination in the workplace, experiencing challenges and discrimination in healthcare and legal and compensation system and labor market. And all these diverse experiences can add up, creating obstacles for return to work. So to make this a little more concrete, we know from an abundance of evidence that racism and discrimination are widespread in Canadian workplaces. I know this has been the focus also in this webinar series. And some recent data suggests, for example, that nearly 4 in 5 Black workers in Canada believe that racism in the workplace has damaged their relationship with their employer. And evidence of this nature provides a crucial context to our findings. Simply put, widespread racism in the workplace can spill over and have a negative effect on return to work outcomes. It impacts the ability of workers of color to report their injuries in a safe and timely manner, and reduce their access to workplace supports and services that are needed to promote recovery. And ultimately, these barriers reduce the likelihood of returning to work following an injury or illness. And because racism is so widespread, we know that these barriers are not limited to workplace. So we have every reason to believe that it exists across every phase and component of the return to work process in the healthcare system, where there are fewer and lower quality services, in the legal system, where people of color are less likely to obtain meaningful representation, in the labor market more generally, where we know that there are fewer opportunities to obtain decent, safe, and gainful employment. And as a field, we think as a field, we need to attend to this reality of widespread systemic racism if we want to understand and address the problem of racial and ethnic inequities in return to work. So is racism actually an important factor when it comes to return to work? So as I mentioned, while the peer-reviewed literature may be sparse, actually a quick Google research will highlight some media, I think really showing racial inequities in the treatment of workers following an injury really clearly. So these are just some headlines. A publicized example is a National Football League, an employer not new to race-based controversies. So in response to previously suppressed evidence showing that football hits were contributing to concussion and brain damage, the National Football League, NFL, settled a $765 million lawsuit for former players. And through the settlement, former players were eligible for compensation and medical care and legal fees when they could show a doctor-verified concussion-related neurological disease. Now, close to 60% of the NFL players are Black, but former Black players found out that it was harder for them to access compensation when compared to their white counterparts. And upon investigation, Black players were being disadvantaged by a practice called race norming. So through a statistical manipulation, actually Black players were assumed to have lower baseline cognitive abilities than their white counterparts, without a true scientific basis for this argument. What this means is that if a Black and a white former player received the exact same raw scores on a battery of tests measuring cognitive functioning, because this is related to brain injuries and concussions, the Black player was presumed to have suffered less impairment and is therefore less likely to qualify for compensation. So scholars argued that NFL practiced race norming was a form of racism disguised as science. Ultimately, this big publicized big example followed an additional lawsuit was followed and led to the end of race norming practices. So the NFL example highlights the need to study aspects of current workplace disability management systems to understand where racial inequities may exist so that they can be addressed. And in concluding my presentation, we think that there are several critical steps forward in the return to work research. So number one, there is a need to build evidence base that elaborates on the experiences of workers of color who struggle to engage in the process of returning to work. This is especially important for those with an occupational injury who are navigating the workers' compensation systems, as I mentioned. Most of the studies were done with the non-occupational injuries. And also it is important for these workers who have to navigate complex organizational work disability management procedures. And number two, the scope of return to work outcomes was limited in our review, with most of the studies focused on whether an injured worker returned to work or not. However, we know little about potential racial inequities that may exist across the whole return to work process, including staying at work, accessing job accommodations, or requesting light duties. And in our study, third, there was a great deal of inconsistency in the measurement of race and the collection and presentation of race-based data in the return to work research. So when we were reviewing the articles, we found that there were inconsistencies in terms of how this was measured. And there is a need to collaborate with health equity scholars, health equity experts, to identify and follow best practices in collection of race-based data. And finally, there's a need for research within Canada to examine how race and racism plays out within our local return to work context. And as I mentioned, most of the studies came from United States and some UK and Israel, but none from Canada. So I would like to thank you. So I included Dr. Arif Jeta's email, who's the principal investigator for the study, and myself. If you have any questions, I'm excited about the Q&A. We can talk about that, or if you would like to reach out to us later, you can send us an email.
That's great. Thank you so much, and thank you for taking us through some of your methodology. I think some of us here, some of who aren't deeply involved in academic research, we hear about sort of comprehensive studies that have looked at a bunch of
Right.
existing research and synthesize them. It's so hard to make sense of how that works, how you arrive at some sort of metric for measuring what you can actually reasonably conclude and combine. So I found that part really fascinating and great to learn about. So if anyone has questions, you're welcome to drop them in chat. You're welcome to use the Q&A. I have a couple of things that I wanted to ask you
Sure.
about from this. The first is, do you have any ideas about why there's been no Canadian studies on this front? I mean, is there a reasonable basis of measurement of similar data looking at race comparisons in Canada, but just not this specific topic?
That's a really good question. There are Canadian studies looking at return to work, but there were no Canadian studies that fit our inclusion criteria, which we were looking at basically return to work outcomes specifically, and also there has to be a kind of a reference group, and they're looking at race. I think, as I mentioned, one of our conclusions is there's very little research around this, and I think that's one of the things that we mentioned in our article, and I think one of the outcomes is, I think especially racial and ethnic inequities, and the study of those is very sparse in the field of return to work and workplace disability management. One caveat, though, we did not look at the qualitative studies. So this was only a review of quantitative studies, and I know that there are certain scholars looking at, these issues more in depth in qualitative fields. So, but that's something that needs to be done.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Can I ask what led you to this line of inquiry? I mean, was there something that you thought that you were going to find? Obviously, not that you would let that lead your conclusion about what the data actually shows. But did you have an intuition about what you were going to discover in this process? And was there anything that surprised you as you got going?
Well, I think when I remember these discussions with the research team, and I showed our research team. So we are all mainly early career researchers at the Institute for Work and Health. And I remember Dr. Arfjet, our principal investigator, we had these conversations. I think one of the things that prompted this was, the conversations that were happening within the larger landscape, right? Of in media and in many aspects. And I think we did talk about not having not we did talk about, I mean, in the occupational health and safety field, um, we talked about more of the need to talk about racial and ethnic inequities, because there's a lot of, information, and there are health equity scholars who have been working in this field for decades. But it is not so much happening in terms of the occupational health and safety field, and especially disability management. So I think we kind of started with that intuition, but we did not know what we were going to find. As you can see, first we identified, there were many articles that were retrieved, but when we actually started looking at what is, the studies that are specifically looking for these inequities, there were only a handful of those. Yeah.
Fair enough. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a question that's come through here. So do you think that racialized workers were precariously employed to start with, or more likely to be precariously employed to start with, and therefore more likely to not be invited back to work after an injury?
That is a really, really good question. And actually, my main area of research is safe work integration of newcomer workers, recent immigrants, and refugees. And we know that a lot of, workers of color, they tend to, as I provided in the presentation, work in jobs that are more precarious, and they are more exposed to hazards. So they work in more shift work and all of that. Um, but however, in our systematic review process, we were able to, there are certain confounding, we call them confounding variables, but we were able to control, certain factors such as gender and occupation and socioeconomic status and all of that. So even though they were controlled, still there were inequities. So I think what I'm trying to say is it is true that racialized workers are more likely to work in jobs that are more precarious. And also, for example, I think there's a new review. So this was a study, I think, done in the United States looking at the workers' compensation data. I think it's very new. I think it's this year. I think Black workers had the highest number of workers' compensation claims, which basically means that they are more likely to injured on job, followed by Hispanic and Latinx. So that means that they are more likely to perhaps work jobs that have a higher risk of injury, and have a higher risk of injury. So, but again, in terms of looking at that, when even those factors were controlled, there were inequities between workers of color and white workers, non-white
Right,
workers.
right. So, our audience today, there's a lot of, we have HR professionals, we have academics, we have people working in nonprofits, we have business leaders.
Yeah.
What sort of response would you like to see from those of us who are working primarily outside academia? Some of us directly on issues impacting worker health and safety, some in consideration of return to work processes or these kinds of claims. Um, what do you think the important things for us to internalize and remember and maybe act on would be?
I think,
Oh, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt. Just we had a quick clarification question before I let you answer.
sure.
We had a question about what Latinx means. So
Oh,
Latinx. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Latinx, sorry,
Yeah,
yeah.
um,
It's, go ahead. So
please.
it, so it is, it's basically, I think it's a term Latin, um, I think it's more, I think emerges from the US context. So it refers to Latin workers, like Hispanic, Latinx. I think that's kind of the the term that's being used.
Absolutely. Yeah, you might have heard Latino or
Yes,
Latina.
exactly. Latino,
I think
Latina, and Latinx is that.
Latinx has become sort of
Yeah.
a umbrella catch-all that like
That's
includes
right.
non-binary people and has become sort of the term of art for that. So thank you for the clarification question. Back to what I initially was asking you
Okay,
about, which is
yes.
what would you like us all to respond to in your work and in what you learned through this process?
I think our main message that we wanted to bring with this research, again, this is we basically looked at the entire, like, the literature that is looking at this issue. So number one, as I mentioned, we need to do more research. Number two, we really need to understand, well, I guess maybe this is not for people who are working in the field, but I think it is relevant. Number two, that is more about um, measuring race, because we found that there were very many inconsistencies in terms of how it's been measured. So it's really important that we actually collect this data. Um, but I think one thing that we wanted to bring forward is, as I mentioned in my presentation, we can show that these inequities exist, but we don't have research or data that shows why they exist. And we have every reason to believe, because as I mentioned, return to work is a process. So we don't know, you know, in which process, what kind of inequities are happening. And I think it is very important to understand the inequities um, that arise from structural factors, discrimination, organizational factors. So all of those, I think that needs to be, I think we really wanted to bring that to attention in terms of this research shows that there are inequities that exist, but we really don't know why. And it is very important to understand at what is, what are the factors, what are the structural, systemic, organizational factors, societal factors that are causing these inequities. And we have some ideas, especially from the healthcare context. So, as I mentioned, from the neighboring fields. So I guess, like, that's one thing that we think. And in terms of maybe thinking about some of the pathways and understanding some of the pathways that, like, racism can impact services that people provide, and, like, who gets injured, and, like, who gets to report their injury. um you know are they able to actively engage in, like, whether or non-white workers policies and practices. um so I think that's kind of like, what we are thinking, what we wanted to bring forth. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that sense.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mhm.
If there are no other questions, if anyone else has questions, go ahead and drop them in our communications channels. Otherwise, I'm going to say thank you very much for your time. This was so interesting to learn about. We've had a lot of conversations today about um, the way that racism impacts everything from legal frameworks that are designed and how they impact people differentially, to structural racism as embedded in HR practices, to interpersonal kinds of conflict that have racist elements in them, to implicit bias and all that kind of stuff. Um, and it's kind of interesting to end the day on a presentation where, we're identifying another front where we see these impacts, and we all. I feel like after today, it's so easy for me to start quickly brainstorming and thinking, well, it could be this, it could be that. Here's a bunch of different explanations, like what industries report higher frequencies of workplace injury, and are those industries that are largely occupied by people of color or have a higher percentage of people? To what extent is this about problems in the exercise of discretion by decision makers who are maybe looking through a flawed or um, unintentionally biased lens at their own perception of how much someone is suffering versus like there's so many interesting directions to go with this, and it'll be great to see what you guys end up working on next. So thank you so much for being here and for all of that and for your very interesting presentation.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you for having me.
Was an